So our third and final speaker, Mhairi McVicar, is Dr. Mhairi McVicar, I should say. She's a reader at the Welsh School of Architecture. She's also project lead in the Community Gateway Initiative in Cardiff. And Mhairi, how do you think we can build an inclusive future in our city centres?
Great, thanks so much, Peter, and thanks for the invite to be here today. As Peter mentioned, I'm a reader in the Welsh School of Architecture, and I've previously also practiced architecture in Chicago and London, and in a slightly less urban sense in the Orkney Islands in northern Scotland. So I'm going to consider how the value of an inclusive city centre is measured. I'm going to do that primarily through some of our joint community university research, celebrating some of the work of our community research partners and our graduates. As a brief introduction to the viewpoint I bring, I'm also academic lead of Cardiff University's Community Gateway, and this is a partnership platform between the university and community, which works on the basis of long-term experimentation, community-led ideas, and co-production. And embedded within this, I lead a master's unit at the Welsh School of Architecture titled Value, and through this we annually investigate how value and wealth in the built environment might be defined. A leading driver of the value unit is taking the time to first understand what is of value in a site before we make proposals, to pay close attention to what's there and to be respectful amidst our encounters, as Helene Frichot proposes here in Creative Ecologies. We adopt an appreciative inquiry or an asset-based approach in valuing what's already there. And we take our cue from economist Mariana Mazzucato's challenge to reconsider who creates value and how we define activities as economically productive or unproductive. We also aim to work within Kate Raworth's donut economic model, placing a regenerative and distributive economy between a social foundation and an ecological ceiling. So our university and community partnerships consider challenges such as how to make use of vacant civic space, mapped here in Cardiff as a pre-COVID condition of emptying city centre shopfronts. How to address challenges of climate change, here mapped as city centre land at risk from flooding in Cardiff by 2060. Our partnerships question the balance of power in planning the city, and they think about who takes care of the city in the short and in the long term, and who is imagined as using the city. So we might consider what frameworks are in place to plan for the messier aspects of life, ecology, joy, and connectedness. And from the points of view of collective community and university research, provocations and actions, I'd like to offer 3 short viewpoints for this conversation from our own experiences. So viewpoint 1, an open call for ideas, and this picks up on some of the ideas-based work that Lev had spoken about. A viewpoint of what can take place if partnership, funding, and organizational structures invite open-ended ideas into our cities. And in considering what can be done with underused civic spaces, I'll introduce how a group of residents partnered with organizations, including Community Gateway, to develop this vacant civic space. Community Gateway launched in 2014 with an open call for ideas, and we had no predefined objectives. A group of interdisciplinary individuals in Grangetown in Cardiff and Cardiff University had a common interest in sharing resources and skills between organizations and individuals to bring collaborative ideas to life. The only criteria we started with was a commitment to engage in a relationship rather than an affair. And this relationship began with residents proposing ideas about what to do with vacant and underused civic spaces in their communities. One of these was the Grange Pavilion, a recently vacated 1960s bowls pavilion in Green in a popular neighbourhood park. Residents proposing the project had no preconceived ideas about what should happen in the space, nor any defined notion of who might own, manage, or use the civic space. There was no fixed community or organisation leading a proposal. The only certainties were that it was vacant and deteriorating. Our partnership launched with a group of students and residents opening up the building for a day for an ideas picnic. A sunny day, cold drink, and paper tablecloths brought enough initial footfall to start gathering momentum to do something about this space. At that time, Cardiff Council were running a Stepping Up programme with a team in place to support community asset transfers of assets owned by the state to assets owned by communities. We also looked to Lambeth's participatory city model, using micro acts of participation to build the capacity and the resources for partnerships between individuals, the state, and external organisations. Council Neighbourhood Partnership seed funding, university engagement seed funding, and other small accessible pots of money enabled several years of small, adaptive, and responsive events, workshops, parties, and research by students and community partners. We started small. A year, then 3 years residency in the vacant building gave scope for partnerships to incrementally emerge, to test ideas, to develop further, and to follow the energy in terms of what worked. A long-term partnership supports an annual Love Grangetown event as a strategic planning and feedback event to establish community-defined priorities for short and long-term actions. Lottery, Welsh Government funding, and charities supported several stages of capital and revenue funding, enabling not only physical redevelopment, but the crucial building of organisational capacity to lead a civic facility under a 99-year lease. This one example of a civic space was redeveloped by a group who came together in response to an opportunity offered by an underused space, with organisational and funding support to build partnership capacity. From this starting point, the value unit have continued mapping the potential of existing, but often undervalued activities in our city centre. So view 2, more than just space. In 2019, the value unit collaborated with Cardiff Sustainable Studio to understand the value of an existing creative enterprise located in the city. Occupying a former munitions factory on Dumballs Road in central Cardiff, the Sustainable Studio have faced relocation due to planned redevelopment of the area. Founders Julia and Sarah describe themselves as more than just space, but as a creative community dedicated to helping each other succeed. We set out to map this creative community and to understand its relation to a city centre location in an industrial area once highlighted as vital in supporting access to cheap building stock for the kinds of industries that any city needs. We've invested in this area, the Sustainable Studio note. Being moved to the outskirts would finish us off. The Sustainable Studio occupies a building that can be easily overlooked in terms of its value. But it is home to multiple businesses. And these businesses operating under the Sustainable Studio create a cascade of support link, mapped here with each business creating its own cascade of links with other enterprises. This supports a network of local partnerships in alignment with policy documents that emphasize the power of creative centres. So what are the values which enable these creative networks? We might consider flexibility, or the importance of access to affordable, messy space. The ability to bring tools for productivity into the city centre. And for organisations to start small, to establish themselves, grow and expand locally as well as internationally. How do we value such spaces? They are easily overlooked in new development plans, despite their direct alignment to local development plan objectives, which emphasise community involvement, flexibility, and managed capacity for change. So we might start to think of place guarding as well as place making. And this is the view our graduates take as they consider environmentally and socially sustainable visions for the city. So view 3, degrowth, or the value of what's already there. 2 visions of the city by recent graduates. In 2020, Molly Nash took a closer look at Cardiff's Penarth Road as a landscape defined by and serving a vehicular prioritised city. She considered what the view might be if we looked at this land from perspectives other than that of the car. And she tested what might happen if the space currently occupied by cars and car dealerships was instead occupied by mixed-use, civic, and green space. She discovered that current proposals for new housing developments on the outskirts of Cardiff could instead be located just in the land dedicated to cars around Penarth Road. She found that Penarth Road is home to multiple small and medium enterprises who could also benefit from greater connectivity, cleaner and greener surroundings, who could benefit from better active travel links, and from a mixed-use development approach to align living, working, and learning locally. Finally, in 2019, Tom Bevan prioritised rewilding in the city centre through a degrowth agenda. Questioning even before COVID the need for yet more new office space, he instead dedicated a prime city centre site next to Cardiff Central train station for reuse, mixed-use, education, creative economy, and flood mitigation as a green sponge at the entrance to the city, offering a statement of intent in a riverside industrial heritage site, which could act as the city's front door. So questions about value in the city are already taking place in Wales. What matters conversations are already prioritised by the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. But if residents of the city are to be convinced that the city is planned and developed for those who live, work, meet, and create in it, then any decentralisation of power to invite community voice must be accompanied by the resources and support structures to enable participatory transformation, as Suzanne Hall notes here. In paying close attention to the physical, social, and cultural assets already present in our city centres, we might value, as Now in a Minute Media's review of the Grange Pavilion observes, inclusive opportunities to grow, meet, and create in our city centres. Thank you very much.
Mhairi, thank you very much for that vision of community-led futuring and action. And I particularly like the idea of access to affordable, messy space. I certainly want to see that in the future of the cities I live in. So we've heard from London, we've heard from San Francisco, and we've heard from Cardiff. So now we want to hear from you. Maybe for you, Judith, Anthony says the structural changes of, high costs and rent in city centres, online, maybe that, struggling high streets and retail is here to stay. What kind of more dramatic things might we need to do to change that?
So I really loved, I loved what both Lev and Mhairi said, but I was particularly really drawn to Mhairi's examples that are quite small scale compared to a London world, but I think are really relevant for London. That's how do you involve community? How do you look at you reusing space? How do we, and there've been some questions about young people and older people coexisting in cities. And I think for the vibrancy and sustainable development of cities, that's going to be really, really important. So I think as a commercial enterprise, we need to think really hard about how we measure value. Treasury is our shareholder. And we're working to really reframe how we're measured in terms of generating return for the UK so that we can develop the environmental and social impact and have those measured as being really important. And I think those examples that Mhairi gave about drawing on what's already there, valuing what is already there to in a genuinely value creation way is a really important part of how we look at what needs to come next. And for big organizations like my own, it means that we need to be really good at listening to people who are already there or people that we want to attract, and not just thinking about our own interest about what we're trying to achieve financially, because we certainly want to be here for hundreds more years, which the organization has already been, but we're not going to be here by thinking only in our own self-interest. So I think there's something around the crisis of retail accelerated by the pandemic. Yes, we've got vacancies, we've got voids, but it's not about filling them with more retail. It's about looking at what other requirements there are. How do we create vibrant city centres because there's a range of different users. And that means that there's more people in there through different times of the day, whether it's education in the evenings or during the day. It's people living more centrally. So I think there's a lot of excitement. I find a lot of things that are exciting, but they're more from what's exciting from other communities, bringing that back into the city centre, as opposed to thinking we've got answers that we can take out to other parts. I think it's a bit of both, but I'd really like to learn from some of those community changes. I know of one up in Aberdeen, which is about a bowling green that was going to be developed into houses, and the local community got together and created a community garden, and they're running all sorts of really interesting workshops now. I love hearing about examples like that, and I want us to have examples like that we can champion and support, as opposed to just be thinking about how to, blitz and create something new and sparkly. It's about how do we build with what's already there. So I probably answered far too rambly a way, but I think this is a real opportunity to learn and do things on a smaller scale. And both Mariana Mazzucato and The Donut Economy are really inspiring books, inspiring thinkers at the moment.
Judith, I was going to say, Judith, that Judith spoke about experience in the city centre, and I think just to sort of imagine that even before COVID and before the question of online retail, there was also just the question of how much stuff do we need? Have we hit peak stuff? And so what's the draw of the experience within the city centre rather than the collection of yet more stuff?
Yeah, and I think Lev began to touch on that with the sort of what we want to be with other humans. We want to have human interactions. What is our new water cooler? It's about recognizing that human contact is valuable, and spending time experiencing things is important. And then for big brands, it's like, what sort of space what do you want to spend your space on? For office occupiers, it's what do you want to be bringing your people into town for, into the city centre, and then to attract more people back into the city centre, because lots of areas have been hollowed out. How do you make sure that they feel like communities that could take root, as opposed to it's just a current trend because it's expedient, because you've got empty space? It's actually it feels like a fundamental reset.
I really enjoyed Lev's comment about focusing on physical need rather than economic need. What is the physicality that brings you in? What's the physical or the mental need that would take you into for contact with other people?
Lev, so just, is city centre retail high, particularly high-end retail we've seen, dominating our city centres? Well, in New York, you can walk miles now and not see a shop. Is it dead in city centres? And do we need to think differently about how we bring vibrancy and sense of place and engagement and fun and excitement and experience, as Mhairi said, to our city centres?
I mean, I don't think retail is dead. I think it's just being re-envisioned. I mean, I think there's the whole revolution of experience retail, which is, I think, the brick and mortar retail world grasping for more authentic experience. And you also have stores in here in America, like Nordstrom's, where these are large department stores that are now opening smaller kind of like satellite shops, where you go and you can get a cup of coffee and you can get a manicure, and then they have a very limited inventory, but you can actually call in advance and have something waiting for you, so you can try it on while you try your cup of coffee and have your nails done. And then I think you're also seeing retail bleed out into the street. I'm sure they have it in the UK, but in San Francisco, there's a ton of parklets where they're taking over parking spaces in order to expand restaurants and even some retail. I don't think retail is dead. I think that there is a pendulum, the convenience community, it's a pendulum, right? Right now, it's all the way over at convenience. And I think you're going to, as we're all seeing the social fabric get dangerously thin, I think you're going to see that pendulum swing back. I just don't think retail is going to be the same as it was. I don't think it's going to be as simple. And I think Mhairi, you were saying it's nice to have, what are our physical needs is what I was saying, right? And I think the economy chases the people, right? We're the ultimate users, and developers and business people, they're trying to create entities that attract us. So if it's no longer just come and buy this thing, it's going to be come and do something. I mean, I think you're going to see a lot more distributed cultural institutions at street level. I think that's going to be a really interesting idea. I just think there's a whole world of different ways to use space, and we've been stuck in a certain kind of mixed use perspective, and that's going to break open. I think especially a lot of cheap rents it's going to foster a lot of creativity. a lot of people who couldn't rent space and try that wacky idea are now going to be able to, certainly in the New Yorks and San Franciscos in the US.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think that's certainly something we're seeing. And certainly if I think of big cultural institutions in London, the Royal Academy has just invested a lot in making their space much more accessible, using the outside space much more bleeding in is the wrong phrase, but really integrating into the outside space in a way that previously they were much more fortress-like. They've now opened it up physically and encourage us to walk through. There's a huge courtyard you can just go and sit and have a coffee. So it feels much more part of the ecosystem than it ever did before. But I agree on the retail experiential side, that's what we're seeing as well.
So there's a question here from John Gibson about, we may recreate a city centre vision that's entirely gentrified and doesn't have places and spaces for, ordinary people or an inclusive set of people. Maybe the people already live there and can't afford to remain anymore. So I'll direct this first at you, Mhairi, if I may. How do we ensure that, as we revitalise and reimagine these city centres, away from the kind of 9-to-5 office monoculture or, shopping dominated, to a new kind of city centre? How do we make that, not just all, closing roads, which obviously is, in my mind, a good thing, and opening them up for people, but roadside cafes and so on, they were one vision of the kind of city centre, which may not be for everyone. So how do we make sure we're inclusive?
I think it's a really good question. It's been a question that's at the heart of the Grange Pavilion, because it's community led, but one of the things that they set out at the beginning was a driver between how do you achieve quality without accelerating or contributing to gentrification. And I think there are some really nice models of community development trusts. And that's the sort of next stage of that particular project. As a group of residents and organizations have gained the confidence to take over one building, the question is, how do we take over a neighborhood and have that be community led? But I think that relates to utterly broken housing system in the UK, which really is about a lot of private development coming in, extracting profit very quickly and leaving again. So in that particular circumstance, we're looking at the possibility of community development trusts taking on some of the housing and some ownership of housing. In that particular area, there's also a really good relationship with local housing associations, and that kind of dampens down the speed of gentrification. But I think a lot of that is about just the empowerment of a community group to be able to take on work at a neighborhood scale as well as at a building scale.
Yeah, I live in Southeast London, and Brixton's a really vibrant sort of mini city in a way, and I think there's that tipping point between gentrification and just really seeing new brands, new experiences, new businesses start alongside very well established community markets that have been there for generations. It is a really important piece of getting the balance right, and I think in many respects community groups and planners have a really important role to play there, in terms of keeping more of a balance in our sort of hubs or community hubs, so that, because in London there's such a range of different city centres, and it'll be the same in other places. How do you get a nice balance? And I think it is important that we have a really well resourced and thoughtful planning environment that helps really keep the good aspects of what's there already, as opposed to allow things to be quite uncontrolled. They are very controlled, so I'm not choosing my words terribly well, but I think it's important that this is not something that can be done by one group of people only. It's really important we keep a balance and that voices are heard and given equal parity.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to ask you another question, but I'm just going to warn Neil Hemmington, if you're still on the call. Neil is the Chief Planner of Wales, and he obviously thinks about the future and how we plan for it. Neil, I'm going to ask you before we close, just what 2 or 3 takeaways have you taken from this call? But before that, I'm going to ask Judith, Mhairi, Lev, thinking about the future and like tipping points that may really affect and impact the city centre positively or negatively. What are things that you kind of see that just on the horizon, and maybe stuff we all know already, like overheating cities through climate change, or they, very, very elder cities in many places, and how that would be different. So, you know, what looking into the future, what, you know, kind of things that you do you spot on the far horizon that might change our city centres? Whoever wants to go first. Lev.
I'll give it a shot. I mean, I think, I don't know if this is far horizon, but for cities that have fixed rail, that have subway systems, they're really up against the wall here. I'm looking at New York and San Francisco. I know that the ridership is so far down. The systems are completely unsustainable financially because they rely so much on fares. And I think that could be a really serious tipping point. I mean, I find in New York, especially, the subway to be the most democratic institution I can think of. I mean, you get on the subway and you see all the people that you otherwise wouldn't see because you run in your cliques, whether they're socioeconomic or racial, whatever. But it's like the ultimate mixing tool of New York City. And that I think that because it's 120 years old or whatever it is in New York, but I think if you start to see the fixed rail systems go under, that's a real problem for cities. And not just from getting people to work and getting them around. I think that's going to really tear apart the fabric deeply.
Mhairi, Judith?
I think we're already at tipping points in many cities in terms of affordability. And I'm just thinking of Lev's positioning of star cities as sort of remaining vibrant and second tier cities. Mapping our graduates, they're increasingly choosing not to live in London because it's just not sustainable for them as a recent graduate anymore. And they're now starting to look at commuting, as you say, sort of a couple of days a week into London. And I think COVID's really accelerated that because a number of practices are now allowing them to work 2 or 3 days a week from home. So we're starting to get more students who are looking either at second tier cities or also rural locations, and are looking at affordable rural living and occasional commuting into cities. So I think there's some tipping points that have already been hit just in terms of affordability as you decide where you're going to spend your life.
Yeah, and I think that tipping point, if it creates a greater nucleus of other cities around the UK, is actually really, really healthy. I think for London, the big challenge is going to be, in a way, it is transport, it is air quality, it is people not being able to afford to live in the city. And I think for me, it's how do we get London to rebalance around being a city where people can afford to live in the centre, so you do get much more of a mix of people, but that hopefully is not at the expense of other cities becoming more vibrant. It's actually about resetting around London becoming a different city right in the centre, so it is more mixed, but that it's part of a range of conurbations, whether it's Manchester, Cardiff, Edinburgh. They're all really powerful cities in their own right, and I think it's an and, but I'd love to see London doing things differently because of the crisis we're currently in, and that's what a lot of people want to see happening.
Juliet.
Hello, I'll just show my video just for a moment so you can actually see me. Thanks very much, everyone, for your fantastic talks. I'm one of the co-hosts for this session and will be chairing one of the later events. But I've had a few questions which I've been posting in the chat, which I gather was the wrong thing to do. But I have another question, which is particularly for Judith, but anyone could answer it. It's based on what you started with, really, that is London as a destination. And I'm very familiar with that sort of narrative about the global city and London's particular goals as a magnet for tourists and firms and so on. Of course, COVID has changed that, and I just wonder what the kind of reframing of the city, perhaps as a much more local place, does in terms of meeting some of your other goals to do with net zero future, thriving communities and biodiversity.
And on the back of that, and Lev, there was a question also challenging your view that the star cities like London will remain the stars, because actually lots of evidence, at least post-COVID evidence, is that they're suffering most, and there's the small cities that. So Judith first, and then Lev maybe on this one.
So I think, Juliet, I started to answer it when I built on Mhairi's answer, in that I think London there's a lot to gain from London reconnecting with not only all Londoners, but also with people in the rest of the UK, and resets in a slightly different relationship with the rest. So it's a London as opposed to London as the big as the big destination. I hope London remains a globally attractive city. I think there's a real vibrancy from London being a city that attracts people from all over the world. But I think it's that how do we make sure that people who already live in London have access to opportunity and get a chance to enjoy the city, live in the city, participate fully in the city, and get to influence the city. And I think there's a real need to rebalance that. But I hope it's not, I really hope longer term that we do start to see people come back and visit, and that people do want to come and live here and spend time here as residents as well as tourists. But it's got to reset so it works for other people as well, I think.
Lev, are the star cities really going to remain the star cities? Because they're just, sometimes they're really difficult places to live in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I was trying to get at, and maybe I muddled it, is I think that, some star cities, there may be new ones and there may be old ones, but I think you're going to see larger and larger cities. The idea that you can live in a smaller, what is now considered a different smaller city, and commute into London a few days a week, I think that's just going to increase. And what that's going to do is that the way we define what's London and who's a Londoner is going to expand wider and wider and wider. And so, for example, I'll get myself in a little hot water because I don't know UK geography as well, but if you're living in Cardiff and flying to London 2-3 days a week, it starts to be less clear. Are you a Londoner? Are you from Cardiff? Who are you? Your sense of identity and the way that's tethered to place is going to change. And I think, the closer in cities will just get swallowed as those star cities, whether they remain the current crop or not. Those star cities are going to expand their boundaries in a cultural sense, if not a municipal, and not a jurisdictional sense. And so I think that's the issue I'm getting at, is people are going to, the places that they identify themselves with and tag themselves with are going to change based on this new remote working and the size of cities. I don't know, will New York disappear? I just don't think so. I know that London is the far and away the largest city in the UK. But I wouldn't want to make predictions about that. But within 40 years, yes, London and then New York, they're still going to be there. Those cities aren't going to disappear in the next decades.
Okay, thanks, Lev. Right, I'm going to finish with asking three panelists, what one thing could we do today to make our cities amazing, vibrant, sustainable in the future? Just one thing. If you only had the money and the ability to prioritize one action, what would it be? And I will start this time with Mhairi and then go to Judith and go to Lev. So what one thing?
Sorry, Peter, can you say that again? I was just looking at Christopher's question on the chat while you were saying that, but could you just repeat the question?
What one thing can we do today, if you only had budget and money to do one action today to make our cities amazing, vibrant, sustainable, inclusive in the future, what one thing would you do today?
I'd invite ideas.
Lovely. Judith?
I'd create a lot more green space.
Lovely. And Lev?
I think cities need to start rejiggering their offices to speak to the increasing mobility, so that there needs to be an office of welcoming for cities. So people who just moved to town are quickly plugged into the services that the city offer, can find deeper community and can connect with their people. I think there's going to be a lot of moving between cities, and cities need to start speaking to their residents instead of luring, employers.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all three. So time is against us and we do need to close in 3 minutes time. So if you want to continue the conversation, you can continue with us on Twitter. So Tom, could you just post our Twitter handles in the chat so you can talk to us further on Twitter. We will be posting the films from the presentations on the Geography and Planning YouTube website online in a couple of days' time. I'd like to thank our speakers. You can thank them in the chat now if you like, but also you can join me in giving them a virtual or actual round of applause. That you've all been fantastic. So if you've enjoyed this session, we've got 2 more. So of events in this series. So they're both in September, and the first is the City in 2040, Governing the Future City, and Juliet, who's Davis, who's the new head of the Welsh School of Architecture, who's co-organised these events with me. She'll be chairing that session with an excellent set of speakers. And then later in the month, on the 30th of September, we'll be looking at how we feed the city of the future. So I really look forward to seeing you all then, and hope that you can join us. And for now, we'll be signing off. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.